These verses in Matthew chapter 5 have been described as some of the most difficult in the New Testament. Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, how does this work? Surely Jesus has abolished the law. I mean, take the food laws, for example. Explicitly, Jesus says that it's not what you eat that makes you unclean. It's what goes out of your heart, what comes out of your heart. That's what makes you unclean. And therefore, he declared all foods clean. And so Christians have no qualms about eating pork or shellfish, things that were forbidden under the Jewish law. But there's two ways in which this passage has to be understood, how the law is fulfilled in the life of Jesus and in the life of the Christian. In verse 18, he says, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And therefore, Jesus is upholding the law. It's going to be fulfilled. How's this going to happen? And he warns, therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom. So how are these laws fulfilled? Well, the first thing is that they prophesy. He says, therefore, in verse 17, I'd not come to abolish, but to fulfill the law. The law speaks, and it speaks about the coming one. The coming one is Jesus. His perfect life, his substitutionary death, his perfect sacrifice fulfills completely the Old Testament in a way no one else ever has or ever could. But then the challenge comes, how does that translate into the life of a Christian? Because we are told, unless, in verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. So how is righteousness going to supersede that of the scribes and the Pharisees? Now, we find that this is unfolded in the fullness of Jesus' fulfillment through his death and resurrection, spilling over into the life of his people. So in Romans chapter 8, the Apostle Paul, who having been a Pharisee and known exactly what the obedience of the law, in fact, he says in Philippians that as to the law, he was spotless. But he counted that as rubbish because there was a new way of righteousness. And in Romans chapter 8, verse 4, Paul says, it's not possible. The law can't bring it about. Simply asking or commanding people to do certain things doesn't produce. But there is a new way, the way of the Spirit, so that the hearts of people are transformed and a new desire to obey God, a motivation that comes from within, that can only be produced by the Holy Spirit. Jesus has laid the foundation and paved the way for this new kind of righteousness that we can adopt. And in the rest of this chapter, what we call the antitheses, you have heard it said, but I say to you, we will look how Jesus examines the external and asks of his disciples, attitudes of the heart. We're almost back to the Beatitudes again. It's what your attitudes is, letting the Spirit govern your heart so that obedience to God comes out of this new way of the Spirit.